Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today for the fifth edition of Spaceport SARABHAI Space Law and Policy Dialogue. I am Dr. Shreya Santra, Curator of Debates and Dialogues at Spaceport SARABHAI, India's first dedicated space think tank. Spaceport SARABHAI's mission is to provide research-based policy guidance to the government and accelerate India's transformation into a developed space economy. The goal of the ongoing Space Reforms Enabler Dialogue series is to help operationalize India's space reforms. Today's dialogue, as you may have guessed from the title, will explore how India can navigate the convergences and conflicts between the Indian Space Policy 2023 and international space treaties and Artemis Accords. The dialogue will be moderated by Ashok GV. Ashok is a dispute resolution counsel and a partner at Factum Law, a Bangalore-based law firm. He is also the Director of Legal Affairs at Spaceport SARABHAI. So with that introduction, over to you, Ashok.
Hi, thank you for that, and good evening to one and all. I think just as a matter of initial introductions, I will probably go to each speaker and have them introduce themselves, and then we will go to the meat of the matter, which is the discussion on the Artemis Accords. I'm going to start with Kriti Upadhyaya. Could you go ahead and briefly introduce yourself, Kriti?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Ashok. Hi, guys. I'm Kriti. Wear two hats currently. I'm VP Strategic Advisory for C2C Americas, which is an intelligent platforms company. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and then I'm also helping put together this small little think tank policy shop in D.C. focused on U.S.-India defense tech ties.
Great to have you, Kriti. Thank you for joining us today. Moving on, can I request Kranti from Dhruva Space to also just briefly introduce himself?
Hi, sure. Thanks. I think you started off with naming me as from Dhruva Space. So I head strategy and special projects at Dhruva Space. And I'm also a board member at the other startup association, which is the Space Fed. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Kranti. Thank you for joining us. Pranav, over to you.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Pranav Satyanath. I currently am a research associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, which is a think tank in New Delhi. I work in the space technology and policy vertical with Ambassador Rakesh Sood, and I've been a space enthusiast since 2018.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us, Pranav. Unfortunately, we do not have Konark with us, who was supposed to join us. He had a personal emergency and had to take leave of us. But we obviously have a very illustrious panel in front of us, and I really look forward to the conversation. The format is going to be informal. I want this to be a free-flowing conversation. The questions are just a prelude to what I hope will be a very robust and engaging discussion on the Artemis Accords. So I'm going to first start with Pranav. Personally, for me, India subscribing to the Artemis Accord was caught me by surprise. What do you think was the strategic thinking that influenced India's decision on the Artemis Accords?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ashok. The reason why it caught many of us by surprise was because as we are close watchers of space, we knew that India always had a preference for legally binding measures. These are measures that are multilateral, negotiated within the United Nations framework, and that allows for all countries' perspectives to be taken into account so that we have a treaty that's made up out of consensus. So when India signed this non-binding set of principles, it came to us as a surprise. But a closer reading of India's activities into space shows us that this should not have come to us as a surprise, or at least at the face value. And this is because of two reasons. India's strategic thought has evolved in the beginning of the 21st century. In the year 2000, Prime Minister Vajpayee announced India's plans to go beyond the Earth's orbit to the moon. And that's when India's real ambitions began, that it was not just a space power that was bound to the Earth's orbits, but also to the moon and beyond. And that logic emanates from two factors. First is that India wants to acquire critical technologies and capabilities that allow it to not only assure its access to space, but also secure its access to the space over the long term. And second, India's ambition is to be seen as a space power that is on par with the legacy space powers like the United States, the Soviet Union, Russia, and China. And in this regard, Artemis Accords provided India a pathway to acquire both technologies and secure its place as a space power. And because Artemis Accords, and while the Artemis Accords and the Russia-China proposed framework, the International Lunar Research Station, both aim to provide the same set of goals. That is, they want to ensure that countries have the right to mine space resources, countries have the right to establish space moon stations. The Artemis Accords approaches it quite a little differently. Firstly, the Artemis Accords has a wide acceptance, which means that it's not just 4 countries that are accepting the Russia-China framework, but it is these 27 plus countries that are accepting the framework. Second, the Artemis Accords, the US and its partners bring on board a larger number of capabilities, which means that if India signs the Artemis Accords, it might have a greater chance to collaborate with these countries and acquire these capabilities. And third, Russia, in fact, when India signed the Artemis Accords, India was not dependent on the Artemis Accords. It was, in fact, the US that required greater dependence. This is because the US is trying to garner the greatest level of support for what it hopes to be state practice and eventually customary law. So India, being a spacefaring nation, a very prominent spacefaring nation, getting India support meant that India had a greater room for bargaining on what it could exchange. So as we saw, India not just signed the Artemis Accord, but it also potentially secured a seat to a International Space Station launch in next year or probably 2025. And finally,
perfect. Sorry, please go on.
If you remember, in 2015, India rejected the draft code of conduct that was forwarded by the European Union. This was because this code of conduct did not involve India's participation quite directly. It was a set of rules that was essentially imposed on India, and there were no clear framework on who would be responsible for governing these rules. The Artemis Accords, on the contrary, offers India a greater set of framework, because Artemis Accords are only a set of principles that will apply in bilateral agreements. The bilateral agreements that were once negotiated for the ISS, for example, would also imply on future missions to the moon. So this means that India has far greater room to negotiate than what people expect, right? Because Artemis Accords is non-binding. The real teeth in the binding instruments comes from the bilateral agreements. So in fact, Artemis Accords provides India far greater flexibility in what it can achieve by negotiation than what a framework by Russia and China could potentially achieve. So therefore, it was natural for India to sign the Artemis Accords.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is essentially increased access to critical technology and greater bargaining powers in how international law is shaped on the subject. Thanks for that, Pranav. I'm going to quickly move to Kriti, because one of the points that kept emerging from Pranav's discussion is technology cooperation and access to technology. And I know a lot of people from the American establishment kind of find the word technology transfer a little intimidating a term, because they seem to think it's free transfer of technology. But going to the larger subject of technology cooperation, right? Considering that the Artemis Accord and the Artemis program are 2 different things, do you see the Artemis Accord as the beginning of a greater technology partnership between the 2 countries? And have you seen any kind of patterns or movements in this regard? Over to you, Kriti.
No, thanks, Ashok. That's a great question. I think, the way that I see it, India joining Artemis Accords builds on the existing US-India defense and aerospace relationship and space relationship, right? I think we've had some great momentum in the past few years, and sitting in DC, I even wrote about India joining Artemis Accords a few months back. So I don't know, maybe it was like a bias within me, but I wasn't very surprised India joining Artemis. I was like very, very happy, but not as surprised, but that could just be me. I think it opens new dimensions to our relationship. But let me just do a brief summary of what stuff that we have done together, right? So this is not surprising. We're already working on NISAR, which I believe is going to take off later this year or early next year, which is this synthetic aperture radar, which is going to be observing Earth. And US and India have built this together. So a lot of tech transfer, a lot of working together has happened on this. We heard in the just this visit and the joint statement that US and India are going to be sending astronauts to the ISS together. And that's not something new. People send astronauts always together, to the ISS. But look at it, the symbolism, right? US and India folks going together. US and India have also said that they're going to work together on, human flights. That was something that was going on already. And one thing I'm sure you guys, you're space geeks, you probably noticed, but for our audience, I think it's important to understand that India was always cagey about, for good reason, about its own space program. When India's space program first came, we had to really explain to people, why are we doing this when we have when we have poverty, illiteracy, all of those things. And I think what India really did a tremendous job at was showing that this space program is for the common people. And today, with everything that's happening now, I think with the geopolitical implications of this Artemis Accords is immense, right? Because you have right now the world that is in two places. There's China coming, which has its own mission to moon and beyond, and there's Artemis. So I think India joining Artemis is important for that. I think India joining Artemis is important and opens new dimensions of our relationship in lunar economy, in space tourism, things that we're still wrapping our heads around. For example, even if you look at this new space policy draft, I think there are a lot of things that now, if we go back and think, we may want to add. What is the Artemis mission? It's about going to the moon for very specific reasons, for getting that helium-3 to make really, really clean energy for the Earth, but also for future missions to asteroids, to Mars. It's about mining minerals. It's about, space tourism. And I think those are things that India will now start thinking about. And then finally, I think why this mission is so important, transverse tech is, of course, there, and that's been happening, and happy to talk about that separately, because we do a lot of work on ITAR, DFARS, and all those cool regulatory stuff that make companies lose a lot of money and lawyers make a lot of money. But the cost efficiency, when Apollo first started, NASA had just one thing, right? It was a dead president's promise. It was everything you need, 5% of federal budget, boom, just get the folks on the moon. It's not the same anymore, right? It's like 0.5% of entire federal budget for NASA. Within that, some for Artemis. And that's why this international collaboration is so critical. And I think rather than what India can get, which it will, today it's about what India has to offer to the world, which is cost efficiency. We run the cheapest space programs. And right now, the world needs a little bit of that.
Perfect. Just a very quick follow-up question, and in keeping with my instinct as a lawyer, I'm going to ask for a yes or a no. Will ITAR regulations be more relaxed for export of space technology to India? Yes or no?
Oh gosh, I can't say yes or no on that. I think in the short term, we will see I see some fine tuning in terms of the amount of approvals coming for India, the way that Indian applications are dealt with. But I think longer term things like actually having ITAR exemptions for India and such, I think that's much, much more long-term horizon, but I'm very hopeful.
As a lawyer would say, it depends. Okay, Kranti, I'll come to you next. We talked about impact on potential budgets for space missions around the Artemis Accords. We talked about technology cooperation. Now, whenever two countries decide to come together, businesses are very excited because it represents new opportunities, new avenues. So from the point of view of a representative of an Indian space startup, and given your success, I don't know if I can call you a startup anymore, But given your position as a member of the Indian space industry, how do you see the Artemis Accord impacting businesses in India that are looking to do business in space?
No, I think, Ashok, it goes back to a question that we were asked earlier when we were part of the 1.5 dialogue. At the India House, the White House rep on the space asked us, can you get the Artemis Accords signed? We said, as representatives of the industry, what do we get from it? We're not sitting here for accords to be signed, but business to be done. Can we be a part of the Artemis program? So I think the offer and the lure has been always on that end, which is having an accord is something about a systemic collaboration between countries. But at the end of the day, to have that collaboration flourish, I think the industries need to come together and be able to do business. That's what creates a recurring dialogue on a tangible basis in terms of benefits for both countries. I think that kicks off the whole point in terms of how can the Indian industry now leverage these accords. For a lot of time, I think when the private ecosystem has been a closed ecosystem in India, and we've looked at exports to be something that is going to take a lot of effort to be able to do something in space, especially in terms of the IP that has to be held by the companies if they're trying to export, in terms of our own export restrictions. Everyone talks about ITAR, but we don't talk about SCOMET in the first place, and how closed door it is in terms of for me to look at an export of something in space to another country. So I think the conversation that it had opened up at an international level in terms of a bilateral relationship between both the countries, how the countries have to collaborate in terms of advancing human civilization outside of Earth. I think it's a start of the whole effort in terms of bringing people together as industries. So that's something that we are looking at, which is the recognition will be the first one. Despite 40, 50 years of advances that India has done in space, a lot of people firstly do not look beyond SpaceX. I'm sorry, but if you ask for a launch vehicle, they say, oh, when is the SpaceX availability? They don't ask about PSLV's launch cadence or the next schedule. And when someone looks at an Indian ecosystem, they stop at, okay, what is ISRO doing? Okay, Chandrayaan is by ISRO. Okay, ISRO is building this. It stops at that. And they have not even dived deep into anything that is related to what's happening in the Indian private ecosystem, how are things being built. We see a lot of people over the last at least 3-4 years, post-COVID, every conference that we had in India, we have a lot of participation from foreign OEMs coming into India to sell things. For them, it's like, okay, if ISRO is buying something, can I sell something? They've never looked at what is the relationship that I can build with India. I think Kriti pointed it out. What can India offer to them was something that they've never even thought about, apart from looking at from what they can sell to the country. So I think what critically it brought into a picture is highlighting the relationship, people talking more about, in the US, people talking more about what space activities have happened from India. And I think it's a surprising fact that a New York Times on their front page talks about Indian startups and talks about Indian industry and what it can boom into. And I think that's a critical edge that we brought into the normal conversations of space industry professionals. I think over the last 2 months, we've also seen Planet announce that they'll be setting up some operations in India. And, that's opening a lot more shows. We have Blue Origins and, other companies coming out of US, thinking about their LEO commercial destination programs and saying that how can we partner with ISRO, signing MOUs with NSIL, in space. See, all of these are in one way, the result of the conversations that had been driving the narrative towards that Artemis Accords. And I think the last two civil space dialogues have created a bandwidth for the January discussion in 2023 to also mandatorily the agencies to discuss about the commercials and how they can include
So what I'm able to gather from you so far is that currently the discussion has been mostly about agency to agency cooperation, more about the established brands in the US looking to see this as export opportunities. But the Indian space ecosystem as such is yet to come to the forefront of the PR narrative. And what opportunities and avenues are available to us is still not the dominant theme of the conversation.
No, that has become the dominant in the last few months. That change has come only in the last. So this year, when the 1.5 dialogue happened, it was parallelly held along with the civil space dialogue. None of the private was part of the civil space dialogue, but every day at the end of the day, as industry, we got an understanding of what happened during that meet. And that's where bulk of these proposals in terms of the discussions on Artemis, the astronaut program and everything had been discussed and put forward. And I think that inclusion started coming a lot more. And the second part of the inclusion that happened during these discussions is many a time in terms of a US-India collaboration, whenever we had dialogues, it was like, okay, there's a Lockheed Martin, there's a Boeing, there's a Raytheon sitting on that table. Primarily on a defense perspective with some interest in space, but never there was actually a space delegation.
And now there's a lot more focus on space.
Yes. So I think when we looked at it in terms of the whole narrative that had been pushed, because we are trying to bring these programs together, I think that changed, and that fast tracks potential for us to collaborate. The collaboration can be very simple. It can be like, okay, there's an RFI out and, this is the requirement. What is your proposal? Okay, you sent a proposal. I didn't like it. It doesn't matter if I get a commercial contract, but having those conversations on a regular basis advances industries. And I think that is the advantage we need to take out of Artemis and continue to push. And I think the R&D funds and that can be flowing in. It's a very different dialogue altogether. Probably I'll take 2 more minutes if I have to do on that. Maybe after a round of questions, I can get on.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thanks, Kranti. That was quite insightful and detailed, insights into what the startup ecosystem thinks about the whole thing. Pranav, I circle back to you. India's position on any US/Russia kind of race has been to kind of sit on the fence, right? We like to call it the non-alignment movement. Do you see the Artemis Accord as the beginning of India taking a stand on matters of international geopolitics, or are we kind of reading too much into it?
I think it's a broader trend. If you look at generally the joint statements by India and the United States, or India and France, all of them show that, India is trying to move away from Russia because Russia is becoming a greater burden. But at the same time, India is also trying to maintain autonomy because US is not the only partner, right? We forget that India and France, just a number of space bilateral agreements and MOUs that they have signed shows that India is not just dependent on the US. India also has other strategic autonomy partners whom it can deal with. So the narrative is certainly that Russia is a burden. And of course, on the space front, we have seen that Russia has unfortunately not lived up to its promises. The Chandrayaan-2 rover was promised by Russia, but we did not get the rover. We did not get the rover. So India had to build that on its own. So the trust really, watered down. So in that sense, the United States offers greater stability. And because the Quad framework also exists there is also a Quad working group on space. So India, Japan, Canada, and Australia, India, Japan, and Canada Australia already have something to talk about. So therefore, it's natural that they would want to collaborate more on the space front. So it's not about non-alignment anymore. I'm reminded of the fact that in 1966, the late Ambassador Krishna Rao, in the legal subcommittee of COPIOS, represented the non-aligned movement on space negotiations. But we've moved far from that. Now it's about strategic autonomy, that India has its own choice to choose. So it's not about non-alignment anymore, but rather how can India benefit from different partners across the world? And it's more pragmatic than a rather ideational stance.
So moving from non-alignment to alignment with many partners, I think that's
right. Multi-aligned. Yeah, some people like to call it multi-alignment.
Perfect. Kriti, you heard Kranti kind of speak about what startups are beginning to perceive in terms of the Artemis Accords and greater technology cooperation. In terms of tangible steps, what do you think are probably the 2 or 3 things that Indian businesses and Indian trade associations can do to translate the signing of the Artemis Accords to actual economic opportunities for Indian startups?
I think Kranti and other startups are doing a great job by innovating, and that's their job. I think it's the governments and everybody else who has to create an enabling framework and environment. And I'm very, very cognizant of the fact that our space program has often been, geared towards certain things. And now there is a shift, right? The joint statement that came out for the first time mentioned defense in space, something we couldn't even have thought about just a few years back. We're talking about, things like militarization of space and so on. But anyway, coming to just the private sector, what the private sector needs, I think we need a more comprehensive space policy. We need that space law that we keep talking about. I think there's so many things that even if we want to do, like Kranti and his other buddies, they have cool ideas and they will make it happen, right? But the governments are the ones who have to create that enabling environment. And few things, if I could, without getting too much into the regulatory legalese and so on, standards are important. You want to work with other countries. I mean, we need to have, and I've seen this in an earlier life. I didn't work on energy matters, but I had colleagues who were working, and this kept coming up all the time, right? EV, climate change, standards. If we're working together, we need to all be on the same standards. It's simple things, right? You're building something, the nails have to be specific stuff, certain screws have to be only from here. It sounds ridiculous, but you don't know how important these things are. Certifications, testing environment for, the stuff that, Kranti and his buddies make. Do they really have all the ability to really not put in their own money, but actually get the ability to test it, see if it works or not? And sorry, Kranti, if I'm like really dumbing it down, but testing certification facilities, telling, giving them stuff that tells them, sorry, do you want to butt in, Kranti? Go ahead.
Not butting in, Kriti. The whole point of it in terms of recognition is what I was saying. India already has standards. ISRO has put in those practices. ISRO goes every 6 months to a year to evaluate different ecosystems and industries, certify them. So we already follow the ECSS and NASA norms in many of our processes. It's already preset. Only thing is that as many businesses in US and Europe have never interacted with Indian companies about the standards we are following. In most cases, we already do. And I think accords are a critical way towards consolidating that effort and putting that, okay, everyone is following the same standards. But in essence, we all do. We don't have to look for an accords to do it. And it's just that no one notices them. And I'm sorry, that's all that I wanted to say on it.
Sure. No, I guess I was talking about the space policy landscape in general. And I think, some of the work that we've done, we've also suggested that ISRO's job should be just enabling the environment rather than, doing things that are redundant for ISRO anymore. Let the private guys do the launches. Let the private guys innovate, do the other stuff. ISRO should be focused on supporting them and innovating on the leapfrog, on the horizon technology. But I think whatever the issue is, I think we do need more testing facilities. We need more clarification on standards, because this is the one thing living in DC that I keep hearing. And absolutely, Kranti, it could be just, best. It could be just two sides not talking to each other, but that's recurring theme that I hear. I think if we are to prepare, we also need insurance liability clauses, insurance. Those are issues that keep coming up. I don't know if they fixed it. Last time I was in India, we had, a whole geek out session on this, how companies are forced to use only certain insurance providers or certain insurance, that there's not as much as flexibility and openness in the guidelines in general. Those are things that I keep hearing. So standards, testing, research and development. A lot of for example, in the US, a lot of research goes into space sector, both from the public, the monies that come from the government, but also the private sector. Much of the research is also led by the private sector. So having those allocations and also, from the government, but also supporting the private sector in doing some of this R&D, I think it's crucial. And I think the space policy, that if we really want to talk about, jumping onto the Artemis bandwagon and actually contributing to the mission to moon and stuff that the Artemis, hopes to envision, we need to start thinking about a lunar economy. We need to have policies in place, right? This is going to be a huge chunk of what's happening, and we need to be able to think about it. What are we going to do on the moon? I think Chandrayaan has done something great. We've found crystals of water on the moon, which is great. We all know we need helium-3 water crystals, all that jazz to get energy. I mean, India is placed, but we need to have policies that enable us to engage. So lunar policy, I think we need at least 2 pages on lunar policy. Come on, somebody do that, right? ISRO, whoever. Let's come up with lunar policy. Let's come up with tourism policy. That is, Blue Origin and the likes have come to India, but they're still grappling. What do we do here, right? There is no interest in terms of people communicating to people. I'm sorry, that's not the right word. I shouldn't say there's no interest, but communicating that interest to people, common people alike, and then having the government think about it. So I think there are a whole bunch of issues where we need to really sit down, think that, okay, the space environment is changing. We need to think about mineral extraction, resource extraction. We need to think about going to the much more beyond within the space. And we need to think about really defense and militarization of space, and our space policy and space law, I think, should be reflective of all of that.
So I think to kind of paraphrase my understanding of what I hear, we are talking about enabling policies being worked out by both governments, part of the Artemis Accord, to kind of make business happen. We're talking about harmonization of regulatory and technology standards and ensuring that it's transparent so that people are following the same standard but not knowing that they're actually complying with the same standard. And 3, of course, having moon as a focus point in policy making. Right. So thank you for that, Kriti. Kranti, mission to the moon, right? 3 immediate areas, or 2 or 3 immediate areas that you can think of where startups can immediately start working towards realizing opportunities. Can you quickly summarize some 2 or 3 opportunities for Indian startups in the mission to the moon?
See, I think not just for startups, I hear there were a couple of startups who were a part of India's Chandrayaan-3 itself. Their names might not come out, but they've contributed towards whatever they can contribute. So I think the idea is sometimes we don't need a lander or a complete mission. We can do a parts of each of these missions. It is critical to know that each one of the industries have contributed something or the other towards the Chandrayaan-3. And the more that we need to contribute is in terms of sensors that we pick up, how are we packaging them? How can we actually make a full sensing capable device that goes on to actually as a payload? Or it can be, multiple redundancy or, radiation hardened. How can we bring in those with normal chips and add things as layers to it? I think there's plenty of that research that everyone in India wants to do as industries, but it's sometimes we are stopping ourselves from that research because of funding. But if that funding problem is solved, I think the exercises from a moon's perspective, I think it'll be about, let's start with manufacturing. What is wrong with it? Why should we reinvent the wheel in terms of technology? Why can we just not be the people who manufacture first? And then how do we actually innovate, not just about something very brand new to come in, but reduction of a cost. A cost of a very good e-submission runs into tens of millions of dollars. But if that cost can be brought down into single-digit $1 million, that's an addition that we're doing as country and as an industry, because we are bringing down the cost of access to the space. If it's bringing down the cost of access to moon, let's do that. So it's incremental developments rather than always trying to see that what is the next big thing that should have happened only from India as a competition from US or other parts of Europe and the world. Maybe not the right course of trying to push the industry into an active state after putting it into slumber for 50 years. So I think there are baby steps that needs to be taken, but the steps are those, which is how do I move from components or subsystem level manufacturing completely done by the ecosystem, where that technology can be imbued into the development, where cost reduction measures and innovative ways to actually reduce the cost come into picture. And I think every of those steps makes a lot more life better. And the reason I say this is, say, there's a Blue Origin, there's an orbital reef, there's a couple of other projects that are coming up in commercial LEO destination programs. But if you look at the funding that had been given by NASA for any of these programs, at least at the early stage, it ranges between $400 million to $800 million. But the rest of the investment continues to be something that they're trying to get from every player out there, whether it is from India, whether it's from NASA again in the next tranche. So there is no full-length commercialization plans for any of these programs. So the private ecosystems across the world should be looking to India, and Indian industry should be working in terms of reducing the cost, so that the next time, if you estimate setting up a commercial space station is going to cost a $10 billion, how can working with India make it at $1 billion? Because the money may be pumped in by the private sector, may be pumped in by the public. But at the end of the day, the development that we show to the world as humanity is that we are still exploring the planets outside of Earth, but we've brought down the cost of how we are exploring. We are increasing the science, but not the cost of the science. So that is a collaborative effort. And that collaborative effort should be nurtured under Artemis. And I think critical parts, a lot of the industry will and academia will say this, which is whenever we try to work on any new technology, even when it is about indigenization, what happens is, okay, you get a 50 lakh grant, 1 crore grant. After the whole dialogue that happened, they said there's going to be an India-US joint development grant. And what is the grant amount? It is 1 crore rupees. What am I going to develop in terms of a critical emerging technology in quantum space with 1 crore funding from each side? So the thought process is, how do we leverage these into increasing those budgets? How do we show this relationship to be driver of increasing the money that is spent or provided as grants, as opportunities? And that's a move ahead. And I think critical part of it is, a lot of times we speak about of Make in India, but we forget the whole concept of Buy America. And there are restrictions in terms of what can be bought. If you're saying an SBIR grant, it didn't say that 100% of the money has to be spent in US. At least 20% of that can be spent in India, but we stopped that flow because we've never made that narrative. So I think if there's a 250 grand SBIR phase 1 or a 750 grand phase 2, can there be researchers from India also participating just for the 20%, but building that narrative of collaborative effort between both the countries? And then next stage, it might be tomorrow the funding flow might happen better in India versus US. I think not citing the Fitch downgrade, but at the end of the day, the ratings that had been given for economies in the last 2 days are showing the results, which is that there is economic slowdown in certain countries and there are certain resilient ones. So the whole concept of a civilization is to minimize those risks and work in multiple countries. So if we've cut down 100 employees in US for Planet, can that mean there'll be 100 employment that can be created in India if they set up a new office? If AST Space is setting up a new plant in India, can we generate more opportunities so that the cost of bringing satellite to phone connectivity at a much cheaper price? And those are the things, small changes that I think we can build on as the next steps.
So cost efficiencies and manufacturing, you feel will be the two areas where we can immediately realize some opportunities for the mission to the moon, right? So, okay, thank you for that.
And the manpower and the knowledge power to actually make it happen, because let's not discount the human resources capital that India has.
Perfect. So in the interest of time, because I'm hoping to keep aside maybe the last 10-15 minutes for Q&A, the last set of questions, Pranav, Quad also has had a focus on space, right? And now with India signing into the Artemis Accord, will the space dialogue within the Quad remain relevant, or is it likely to move exclusively into the conversations around the Artemis Accord?
I think the conversations around the Artemis Accords are a little bit into the future. Right now, what the Quad is focusing on is what assets it can use to benefit the 4 countries back on Earth. This includes Earth observation, maritime monitoring, IUU fishing, and this will be the priority. And I think even though India has signed the Artemis Accords, we shouldn't get carried away. I still believe that India has a lot more to achieve within the Earth's orbits. Human spaceflight in the low Earth orbit, long-term sustainability in the low Earth orbit, just growing infrastructure, the number of satellites that we have. So these are the areas that I think India would still like to improve on before embarking on those very, very ambitious missions.
Perfect. Thank you, Pranav. Kriti, going back to the point you made earlier about how governments need to enable startups and companies to kind of do business in the wake of these kind of developments. Can you list maybe 2 or 3 things that say the Ministry of External Affairs or the Ministry for Trade and Commerce in India, some initiatives that they can take to help Indian space businesses realize opportunities arising out of the Artemis Accords?
Sure, but can I just quickly answer, just add to what Pranav said? I think that the way that I see it, I agree with Pranav completely. And the way that I see it is that Quad and others, be it the Outer Space Treaty or Quad, these guys are more concerned with norm setting, right? And then I think Artemis is like the implementation part, because Artemis deals with, even if you read the Artemis Accords, it like mentions Outer Space Treaty every 2 paragraphs, right? And that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you get the point. It keeps mentioning the Outer Space Treaty. It keeps mentioning the registration code, very liability agreement, various other things that it hopes to implement and working within that environment. So I think Artemis is laser focused on, like Pranav said, future. It's focused on moon and beyond, and it's focused on the implementation part, what NASA, ISRO, other folks, I think it deals more with what the engineers have to do, what the others have to do, what businesses have to plan about. But I think Quad, some of the work that it's doing is very critical. Like Pranav said, on right now issues, be it climate change, maritime domain awareness, remote sensing of the Earth, and also just setting standards, which again, I really hope governments do much more about this, because if we don't decide the rules of the game, somebody else will, and somebody else is making moves that are changing what is acceptable or not acceptable. And by somebody, I mean China, with all of its stuff that it's doing in space. But what governments can do, I think, like I said, sorry to sound like a stuck record, but yeah, just come up with a very comprehensive, nice space policy. And I don't want to, I think kudos to the government for all the great work that they've done. We need to realize they're also in uncharted territory. They're also figuring this out like all of us. But a more comprehensive space policy would be great. The way that I read the space policy, I just felt that there was very less that was new. It was like stuff that we already knew, the various organizations, what they'll do and everything. I think we've already reached that. I think we need more vision. We need to think about, okay, what do we need to get done now? What do we need to get in 10 years? What do we need to get in the future? And have a space policy and a space law that reflects that. I do want a space law. I think all of us are looking forward to that, hoping that there'll be more regulatory ease, there'll be more regulatory clarity. I think clarity and regulatory ease is something that folks are always looking forward towards. So comprehensive space law, R&D funding, and also avenues that increase R&D funding for private sector, testing certification. I mean, the other day I was having a call and somebody mentioned to me that we don't even have testing for paragliding. So people who want to do paragliding, they have for equipment, have to go outside of India. It's ridiculous, but I just want to give you a sense. We're talking about space, but even in something as simple as paragliding equipment, we don't have adequate certification and testing facilities within India. So yeah, I think just creating that it's a new sector, creating that supporting environment for that and providing policy stability and clarity, I think, is key. So without going into too many details, and then we have a bunch, sorry for the plug, but we have a bunch of reports on our website that go really into this. We're also releasing within the next month a very comprehensive US-India space report that will go much more into recommendations. But yeah, space policy, comprehensive space policy, just 2 words.
Perfect. So I think we are down to the last leg of the conversation. So I want to keep some time aside for Q&A as well. What I've generally understood from the conversation so far is that the Artemis Accord is a great starting point for what appears to be a very fruitful relationship between India and the US in the making. But to see to it that it translates to benefits for businesses and companies on the ground, there's obviously a lot of implementation framework ahead of us that each government and the entire ecosystem needs to kind of come together and achieve. So thanks to all of you for your wonderful insights. I think I'm going to quickly jump to the audience now and see if anybody has any questions. Can I please request people to use the raise hand option, and then I'll quickly jump to them. You will see at the bottom of the Zoom screen a raise hand option, and you can do that. Otherwise, I'll probably gather the questions from the chat window and pose them one by one. Okay. So let me first, clearly nobody's raising their hand, so I think I'll just gather the questions from the chat window. I have one question, which I'll probably go to Pranav first. How does the accord affect our India space collaboration with Russia? Do you see this impacting this negatively or positively? Sorry, before we cut to that, I believe Ambassador Sood wants to speak. I would love to hear his thoughts. Narayan, is Ambassador Sood already in the discussion?
Yes, I am. I mean,
yes, Ambassador Sood, over to you.
Sorry. Thank you, Ashok. I mean, it's great to see you. I think it was a great conversation. You know, I'm a little disturbed by this overly enthusiastic kind of an approach to Artemis Accords. And I think both Kranti And Pranav, in his last comments, actually, when he said that we shouldn't get carried away, and I think Kranti actually put a bit of a realist perspective on it. So let's be clear. Would we have signed after all, the Artemis Accords have not emerged in 2023, right? So why did we sign it today? And and the whole thing, you yourself in your opening remarks said that it took you by surprise. It took everybody by surprise. Trust me, including people in ISRO. Because ISRO guys are on record as not having looked upon Artemis Accords with favor for obvious reasons. So there is politics that is driving it. Given the fact that space is getting now divided into two opposite camps, look, if the US-Russia International Space Station cooperation could have continued, you think the US would have come out with Artemis Accords? No. So let's be clear what we are doing. Let's not, look at it as if it is the best thing that's been invented since sliced bread. So that's the first thing. Second, it has nothing to do with your accessibility to with your access to critical and emerging technologies. That is happening through a bilateral agreement between India and United States, the ICET initiative. I'm sure the listeners and all of you know about it. So therefore, because the Artemis Accord is not legally binding, it imposes no obligations on you. It imposes no responsibilities on you. It's just a partnership. So what you do with it depends on what you negotiate bilaterally with NASA, which is obviously the implementing agency. Now, as Kranti put out, the NASA budget even this year has come down from the previous years. If they want to revive their position in space, they need additional money. Now, partners in Artemis also include rich countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE and so on. It also includes, to give it greater heft and global appeal, countries like Ecuador and Rwanda. I mean, Ecuador, Rwanda are not going to either contribute financially but it provides a geographical spread. So it's a political move. We have taken a political decision. And that is the first thing that we need to understand. And therefore, what we are going to get out of it, what we are going to give into it, in terms, after all, our budgets are pretty limited. For the last 5 years, the ISRO budget has been limited to about between $1.2 and $1.4 billion a year. That's about it. So therefore, what is it how much extra are we going to be able to do that we can contribute? That is a separate issue. That will depend upon what is the negotiation between ISRO, which is the implementing agency on our side, and NASA. The other thing that Kranti mentioned, which is very valid, is about the private sector involvement. Because we know, and we have seen this in the last couple of years, and that is why I don't think that a comprehensive space policy is an answer. A space law, a legally binding document is an answer. Policy is not justiciable. A policy is not something that you can go to court with in case of a dispute. So if you want to attract investment into the space sector, as the burgeoning Indian private sector startups want to do, then you need to have actually a Space Activities Act. And this is what is critically required. And finally, all I would like to say is that I think that we will also have to come to terms with the inconsistency with the Moon Treaty. We've seen that the Saudi Arabia has walked away now from the Moon Treaty. Some of the Europeans are looking at that, especially including the French and the Australians. And we will also have to come to terms with it. Because the fact is that this Artemis Accord was preceded by something that came out in 2018, which defined space as contested domain, and which said that there is a militarization and all the rest of it. So yes, let's understand we've taken political sides. Let's understand that what the benefits we are going to get will depend on what we put in and what we bilaterally negotiate. And that will come in from much more from the private sector, because I don't anticipate ISRO getting 25% budget increases every year. If NASA is getting budget cuts, I mean, notwithstanding Fitch and all the rest of it, they got that budget cut before Fitch. This year, I don't know, in this financial year, I don't know what that will do to NASA's budget. But essentially, I think we need to be a little less breathless and a little more realistic about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood, for bringing in the real-world political perspective for the conversation. Unfortunately, we're running very close to the end of the session, so I'm going to quickly take 3 questions from the chat window, and we'll probably close with that. The first question that I will take is from Victoria Sampson. It says, would India consider joining the Chinese-Russian International Lunar Research Station effort in the wake of signing the Artemis Accord? Can I quickly get very brief answers from Pranav and Kriti on this? Pranav, over to you.
Well, I don't think so. Purely because our relationship with China is really bad, and we have Pakistan on the ILRS, and on the capability side in the far future, I don't think these sides are going to bring a great deal of capabilities. So I don't see a prospects of collaboration with the Chinese and the Russians, especially on the moon. Perhaps we might have independent collaboration with Russia if the Russian economy picks up, but not on the moon.
Nope.
Kriti, no? Okay. I got a yes or a no answer this time. Kranti, over to you. Arup has made a point. Strength is in applications. Coming to the lunar program, what do you think are probably those 1 or 2 areas within the realm of applications that India can leverage its capabilities on?
No, I think what happened in terms of Digital India is a very, very big initiative in India. We forget the amount of change that had been, at least in an urban individual's pocket, in terms of just scan something as QR, go through your, Digi-Yatra at the airports. The kind of integration that we've brought in terms of a lot of things, while addressing a lot of issues in terms of efficiency of these applications by the kind of diversity that we've brought in as a country. When we try to look at satellite imagery data analytics, we get data of deserts, mountains, terrains that are very plain, Deccan plateaus, and the coastal areas that give us a very diverse ecosystem, and the oceans and the islands. Nowhere else is that level of data access available for a single country to spur the designers of applications. And I think that's a critical aspect in terms of learning and imbibing that strength in our businesses. And the day we start doing it, what can be done as an AI ML algorithm on something else can be expanded onto something else. Why, if you're looking at water studies on the Earth, and we've come up with a very good algorithm, why should we not try to do it on something else in terms of detecting certain other elements? So I think that will be a critical one. We have to leverage the geodemographic spread that we have and the variety that we bring in terms of the big data that goes into building our algorithms. And I think that will be the game changer on an applications perspective in terms of doing things outside of the Earth.
Perfect. So I guess that brings us to the end of time, because we're at 8 p.m. So look, as a moderator, the challenge always is to ensure that I bring the best out of all the panelists. Each one of you have been so wonderful and so insightful. I'm just really sorry that I didn't have the time to discuss this in more detail and get your views on a host of other topics. And you can see just by the sheer number of questions how stimulating this entire conversation has been. So I encourage all the attendees to reach out to the panelists on a one-on-one conversation. Let this not be the end of the dialogue on the Artemis Accord and what it means. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Thank you for your time and for being as generous with your ideas and your viewpoints. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. And that brings us to the end of the panel.